Kamala Harris was already under pressure. Senator Kennedy challenged her record, line by line, on national TV. Then just when she tried to recover, Tulsi Gabbard leaned forward. One line, one fact, and it didn't just derail the conversation. It ended it. Like and subscribe. And tell us, do you think records matter more than rhetoric? She was used to questions. Not this one. Not from him. The Senate Judiciary Committee was already behind schedule. 3 witnesses were late. 2 staffers had emailed in last-minute technical conflicts. But the chair kept things moving. Today's focus was criminal justice reform, and every seat was filled. Vice President Kamala Harris had arrived not as a guest, but as a featured panelist. She wasn't just offering input. She was defending the administration's record on crime and sentencing. Her entry was smooth. Tailored navy suit, pin-sharp heels, confident stride. The room knew she came prepared. Maybe over-prepared. 3 thick binders, a water bottle, notes clipped in color-coded tabs. Kennedy was already seated, hands folded, suit relaxed, expression unreadable. He hadn't said a word during the opening remarks, hadn't even blinked when Harris launched into her 10-minute defense of the administration's reforms. She ran through key points: a 12% reduction in mandatory minimums for nonviolent offenses, expanded federal clemency review boards, increased Department of Justice funding for community-based programs. Then she turned it personal. I spent years in the courtroom. I know what real reform takes. I know what it looks like when people are sentenced by systems that weren't built for mercy. There was applause. A few journalists in the back nodded. One aide whispered, "She's crushing it." But Kennedy hadn't moved. The chair opened the floor for questions. 3 senators passed. Then Kennedy looked up. "Madam Vice President," he began slowly, "I've reviewed your statements and your numbers, and I'd like to go back, not to 4, but to 4. Kamala's eyes narrowed. Her smile didn't fade, but it froze. Kennedy flipped a page. "Back when you were District Attorney of San Francisco, you opposed a bill that would have required your office to investigate officer-involved shootings. You called it unnecessary. Do you still believe that?" The room turned. Harris straightened in her chair. "Senator, with all due respect," but Kennedy wasn't done. "You also locked up over 1,100 people on marijuana charges, then laughed about your own use in an interview." Gasps, not loud, just collective. Kamala's expression held. "Barely." "Are you here to defend a record?" Kennedy asked. "Or rewrite one?" The chair leaned forward. "Senator, we ask that you—" Kennedy raised one hand, not to interrupt, just to pause. "One question, Madam Vice President. In your view, is justice a record or a narrative?" Kamala blinked, because that wasn't just a jab. It was a loaded trap. She looked ready to counter until another voice cut in from the panel's edge. Calm, cold, surgical. "I can answer that, Senator." It was Tulsi Gabbard, and she wasn't smiling either. Some lines fade with time. This one was burned into memory, and Tulsi brought it back without blinking. The room pivoted. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't part of the Senate Judiciary Committee. She had been invited as a guest speaker on the panel, a former presidential candidate with military service and an outsider's reputation. She hadn't spoken until now. Her voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Not angry, not performative, just clear. Senator Kennedy asked if justice is a record or a narrative. I'd argue it's both, unless the record contradicts the story. She turned to Kamala directly. "And with you, Madam Vice President, it often does." Kamala's head turned slowly, her lips pressed together. This wasn't a debate she'd prepared for, because it wasn't policy. It was personal. Tulsi kept going. "I haven't forgotten what you did as Attorney General of California. You blocked DNA testing that could have freed a wrongfully convicted man on death row. You said reopening the case wasn't in the interest of justice." A sharp inhale from the book row. Staffers glanced at one another. Kamala shook her head. "That's not a fair characterization." Tulsi raised a hand. "The Los Angeles Times called it exactly that. And when you were asked about it in 2010, you dodged. Today, you say you stand for criminal justice reform. But back then, you fought to keep innocent people locked up to preserve your conviction rate." She said it flat, no flair, like reading a diagnosis. Kennedy, still seated, didn't move, didn't smirk. He simply folded his hands, letting the moment expand. Kamala tried to pivot. Every DA faces difficult decisions. Context matters. Tulsi didn't let her finish. Context? Let's talk about context. Thousands of families, mostly Black and Latino, had their lives destroyed under policies you supported. You laughed about smoking marijuana, but the people you incarcerated, their lives didn't get a punchline. Now the moderator spoke up. Congresswoman Gabbard, please keep it. Tulsi didn't raise her voice. She just finished. I'm not attacking. I'm reminding, and if your justice platform erases your justice record, then we're not having a hearing. We're having theater. The room was locked. Kamala stared back, stone-faced. This wasn't the debate stage of 20. There were no flashy moderators, no breakout polls. This was Washington, and Tulsi had just detonated years of spin with 2 minutes of memory. The moderator tried to recover. Let's return to the policy recommendations. But the crowd wasn't ready. Kennedy finally leaned into the mic. You mentioned context, Madam Vice President. I've read yours, and I think the American people deserve the rest. Kamala took a slow breath. Her eyes flicked across the room. For the first time, her voice came back not with power, but with something far rarer. Control barely holding. I've done the work. I've evolved. That should count for something. Kennedy tilted his head. It does. But so should the people who never got a second chance. Silence. Not even Tulsi moved. Because once again, it wasn't about how she answered. It was about what she couldn't deny. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just read what she wrote and asked her to explain it. The air in the room hadn't moved. Not since Tulsi finished. Not since Kennedy leaned in. The Vice President of the United States was now sitting silently, shoulders back but jaw visibly tense. Kennedy flipped one page of his folder. No dramatics, no binders, just a plain white sheet and a single sentence highlighted in yellow. He didn't raise it. He read it. California Attorney General Kamala Harris, 2011. Maintaining conviction rates is integral to our department's integrity. Kennedy looked up. Do you still believe that? Kamala looked straight ahead. I believe in balance, in making hard calls. Those comments were from a different time. Kennedy nodded once. They were, which is why I'm asking whether you've ever publicly corrected the record. She hesitated. I've addressed my record many times. Kennedy kept going. Addressed it, yes. But have you ever said on record that some of what you did was wrong? Another pause. Warren or Booker might have stepped in to run interference if they were there. But this panel had no lifeguards. Only silence. Kamala lifted her chin. I believe in evolving with the times. My record reflects both enforcement and reform. Kennedy looked almost disappointed. That's not an answer, ma'am. That's a mission statement. A ripple went through the room. One journalist at the back muttered into their mic, that line's going viral tonight. Tulsi didn't speak. She didn't need to. Kennedy flipped another page. Another quote, Madam Vice President, again from your time as AG, we do not believe retroactive sentence reductions serve the interest of justice. He raised his eyebrows. You denied early release to nonviolent drug offenders. At the same time, you supported clemency for certain politically connected individuals. Would you call that equal justice? Kamala didn't blink. Senator, criminal law is never black and white. Kennedy nodded again. Then why were your policies? Silence, again. This wasn't grandstanding, it wasn't cruelty, it was slow, precise dissection, like a lawyer building a case not for TV but for history. And the more he pressed, the more the room noticed something odd. Kamala wasn't pushing back. She was absorbing, she wasn't rattled, she was cornered. Because when Kennedy dropped the volume and turned to facts, even power stopped speaking. The moderator cleared his throat. Senator Kennedy will return to general questions. But the spell had broken, not because Kennedy had yelled, not because Tulsi had attacked, but because every quote they used came from Kamala herself. The public record wasn't being twisted. It was being read. And for a nation used to narratives, that was the one thing this hearing couldn't control. One was reading history, the other had lived it. But neither of them was letting her forget it. The air didn't reset. Even during the water break, nobody moved like the conversation was over. Staffers whispered, phones buzzed, but the focus stayed locked on Kamala because the damage wasn't theatrical, it was surgical, and Kennedy wasn't finished. He leaned back, finally placing his folder down. Then he spoke, slowly. The generation before mine locked people up with impunity. The generation after mine wants to throw out the idea of accountability altogether. I thought maybe your generation had found the balance. He looked at Kamala, but I'm starting to think it just figured out how to sound like both, without being either. Even Tulsi turned her head slightly at that. Kamala took a slow breath. Senator, I stand by the fact that my career has evolved with the needs of this country. Kennedy nodded. Evolution's a good thing, but when it only shows up in speeches and never in signatures, it's called branding. The moderator cut in, trying to redirect. Congresswoman Gabbard, would you like to add anything before we move to closing remarks? She didn't hesitate. I'd just like to say this. We are not here today because Kamala Harris made a tough call in 2004. We are here because she built a career on those calls and then pretended they never happened. No one interrupted. People didn't just suffer under her policies. They disappeared into a system that praised her for being tough on crime, while their families fell apart. Tulsi's voice didn't shake. It never does. We are now governed by leaders who tell two different stories about themselves, depending on who's in the room. The problem with that is eventually both rooms start watching. Kennedy didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because this wasn't just about Kamala's record anymore. It was about the culture of curated reinvention. Tulsi looked directly at her. It's not the mistakes that bother people, Madam Vice President. It's the denial, the silence around them, and the confidence that no one would ask you until now. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't tense. It was resigned. Kamala looked away, just briefly, and that was the moment. Because when a sitting vice president avoids eye contact during a hearing about justice, the nation notices. One line from Tulsi, one stare from Kennedy, and every media outlet held their breath at once. The network feeds had all gone live by this point. 3 major cable channels, 2 digital outlets, 1 social media stream with over 80,000 watching in real time. But none of them were speaking. The anchors paused. The scrolling headlines stopped mid-sentence because they all saw the same thing. Kamala Harris, Vice President, seasoned litigator, polished communicator, had stopped answering. Tulsi had dropped her mic. Kennedy hadn't moved. And now the only sound in the room was the quiet turning of press pens against notepads. The moderator tried to lighten the room. Let's shift to future-oriented policy. Congresswoman Gabbard, where do you see bipartisan opportunity? But Tulsi didn't bite. I'll answer that in a second, but I'd like to finish something first. The chair hesitated. Briefly, please. She nodded once, then turned back to Kamala. We can't have honest conversations about reform when the architects of the system still pretend they only walked the halls, never built the walls. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. And for the first time, Kamala replied with something close to emotion. I've done more for criminal justice than anyone on this panel. Kennedy leaned forward. Then why do the numbers say otherwise? Kamala turned sharply. You cherry-pick data. Kennedy calmly lifted a single page from the folder, held it up for the camera without saying a word. The heading read, Incarceration Disparities in California, 2004-2010. Source, DOJ Archive. He didn't read a word of it. He just let it sit there. The implication was heavier than anything he could have spoken. You said it. You signed it. You stood on it. So don't call it cherry-picking when the fruit came from your own tree. The camera panned to Kamala. She blinked. Once. Twice. I stand by the decisions I made with the information I had. Kennedy didn't smile. Didn't even nod. That's fine, but don't sell it as redemption. Sell it as record. Tulsi followed without pause. Or better yet, don't sell it at all. The room froze again. One line from Kennedy, one follow-up from Tulsi, and that's when the headlines changed. Screens across America lit up with variations of the same phrase. Kennedy and Gabbard confront Kamala over past decisions. No escape from the record. VP pressed in live hearing. Tulsi, don't sell it at all. It wasn't just a moment, it was a message, and it was one that wouldn't be cleaned up in post. By the time she answered, the country had already replied. The vice president adjusted her mic, her jaw tightened just slightly. For a moment, it felt like she might fire back with everything: stats, speeches, strategy. Instead, she paused. I'm proud of my service, and proud that I've continued to grow. If people want perfection, they'll be disappointed. But if they want results, I've delivered. Kennedy didn't interrupt. He just watched. The statement hung in the air like it was waiting for permission to land. Tulsi leaned back. No smile, just a look that said, too late. Because this wasn't 2020. This wasn't the debate stage. This was a hearing where the audience didn't cheer. They judged. And at that moment, the public was already reacting. Clips from the hearing were already clipped, captioned, and climbing. One had Kennedy's question, record or narrative? Another had Tulsi's warning, both rooms are watching. A third simply replayed Kamala blinking, then saying, I stand by my decisions. The comments were brutal. Why did she dodge Tulsi's point again? She can't just evolve and erase. Kennedy didn't even raise his voice. That's what makes it worse. A trending thread on X, formerly Twitter, posted a side-by-side. Kamala's 2004 press release defending mandatory minimums, next to her 2024 statement opposing them. Caption, when your brand changes faster than your beliefs. Back in the room, the moderator tried to regain rhythm. Let's proceed to closing reflections. Vice President Harris, any final remarks? Kamala nodded stiffly. We are not perfect in how we administer justice, but we're better when we choose leaders who know what it means to evolve. She glanced once at Kennedy, then at Tulsi. Some people talk about justice. I've lived it. Tulsi didn't move. Kennedy's brow arched just slightly. He responded without drama. And some people live with the consequences of those who called it justice. Another ripple. The hearing's final minutes were technically procedural. Votes, calendar dates, follow-ups. But no one cared. The story had already walked out the door. By the time Kamala closed her binder, the hearing wasn't about reforms. It was about the price of selective memory and the cost of speaking too late, in a room that had already heard enough. When the lights shut off, only one line stayed behind, and it wasn't the one Kamala planned. The panel ended, mics went dark, staffers poured in to shuffle papers, unplug cables, escort guests out like any other hearing. But this one was different, because no one in the building had moved past what they'd just heard. Kamala exited quickly. Her aides closed ranks fast, a tight cluster of suits and urgency. She didn't look at Kennedy, didn't glance at Tulsi. She left like someone finishing a duty, not someone owning a moment. Tulsi stayed behind, spoke with two young veterans seated in the back row. Took no questions, didn't offer sound bites. Kennedy stood last, collected his notes slowly, nodded once to a cameraman packing his tripod, then turned for the exit. That's when one young journalist leaned forward, not from a major network, just an independent. Senator Kennedy, and she asked, what made you go there today? Most people avoid confronting her record. He stopped, looked her in the eye, because some folks confuse kindness with silence. But when silence protects the powerful, it's not kindness anymore. It's cowardice. That wasn't a quote for headlines. It was a line for memory, and within hours, it was everywhere. On Reddit threads, silence isn't kindness, it's cowardice. On TikTok loops over black and white footage, on shirts, pinned graphics, thumbnails of commentary reaction videos. Kamala's defenders pushed back hard. Context matters. She's evolved. She shouldn't be punished for being tough on crime when it was popular. But the replies said it all. She wasn't punished, she was just finally asked. Later that week, a college student at Howard University wrote in a campus op-ed, I used to admire Kamala. I still respect her journey, but Tulsi reminded me that true leaders don't bury receipts, and Kennedy showed me how to read them. That sentence went viral too, and for all the branding, polling, and prepping her team tried afterward, it couldn't wash out what stuck. one hearing, two opponents, three quotes, and one sentence that outlived the panel. Don't sell it at all. That wasn't just a closing argument. That was a warning, not to Kamala, but to every leader rewriting their own history before someone else reads it out loud. Like and subscribe if you believe integrity isn't what you say on camera, it's what survives being read back to you, verbatim. And tell us in the comments, which line hit you hardest and why?